Hi, welcome back to Ancient Philosophy. This is Lecture 2 on the Euthyphro Dilemma. I'm Dr. Poston. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama in the philosophy department. I'm also director of the New Pre-Med Institute. So, as I said before in the first lecture, I'm really looking forward to this summer course with you guys. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about some of these philosophical ideas. And the first main topic that we're going to talk about is this fascinating dilemma that people continue to write and publish on. So, in this dialogue from Plato, we meet Socrates for the first time. So I thought it'd be good to start off with a little introduction to who Socrates is, talk a little bit about Plato, talk a little bit about the dialogues, so that you just sort of set the stage to know, a little background as you're approaching the Euthyphro. So let's get started. So we have the figure of Socrates, whose dates are up there. Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. Right? So it's really fascinating that Socrates is this figure that we don't have any written works from Socrates. Everything we know about Socrates comes from people talking about Socrates. Socrates was a very influential figure in Athens. He occurs as a figure in some of the other Greek authors. We'll come across some quotes and talk a bit about that as we move through Plato's works. We meet Socrates. He meets Euthyphro in the king's court. So this is one of the legal arenas in Athens at the time. And Socrates, Euthyphro is surprised that Socrates is there, and he's wondering what's going on. And Euthyphro, asks Socrates why he's there, and Socrates reveals that he's under indictment from Miletus for the charge of corrupting the youth. So when we read the Apology and talk about that next week, we will learn much more about this charge that Socrates was under. The Apology is really fascinating because the Greek word from which we get apology is apologia, and that means a defense. And the Apology is really Plato's defense of Socrates. So what we'll see in the Euthyphro is we'll see sort of how Socrates operates. Socrates is known for this method of question and answer, and he has a particular goal in mind often when he is inquiring with someone. This is known as the Socratic. His method is known as the Socratic method, and the goal that he's after we'll talk about in this lecture. All right. So let's get started. So let's start with Euthyphro's story. So Socrates, as we said, meets Euthyphro at the court, and he's, after their initial discussion to try to figure out, Euthyphro wants to know, Socrates, why are you here? And Socrates tells him, about Miletus' charge, and then, Socrates, questions Euthyphro about, why he's here. And Socrates is really surprised to learn that the reason that Euthyphro is at the court is that Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. Now you might think initially, oh, this is a good thing to do. You can imagine it's a very difficult decision for Euthyphro, but you might think, well, if his father really did murder someone, perhaps he's the only person, in the relevant sort of capacity who can bring his father to court. So you might think, well, this is a noble thing to do. But as Euthyphro tells the story gets a little more curious. So Euthyphro's father evidently ran a well-respected household that had, at this time, servants and slaves. And what we learn is that one of the servants got drunk, and in a drunken rage, killed one of the household slaves in Euthyphro's father's house. Euthyphro's father, most likely angered by this, most likely, trying to figure out what should be done, takes the servant, imprisons the servant, and then sends someone to go inquire about what should happen to the servant. Right? So there's no question here of the guilt of the servant. we're assumed that the servant did in fact, right, murder, kill, this household slave. But what happens is, as this person's going to inquire what should be done, Euthyphro's father doesn't feed the servant, doesn't take care of him, throws him in, you might say, dungeon, forgets about him, and the servant dies. Right? And so, in that context, right, Euthyphro was concerned to bring, right, his father to court to prosecute him for murder. Now, there are a lot of dynamics going on in the story that we probably can't pick up on, because we live in a much different cultural era than 4th century Athens. But we can imagine there's a lot of family shame, a lot of family pride, and certain things just aren't done. And you have questionable circumstances like this one. You might think, well, perhaps it wasn't a thing to do, but the person that died was in fact guilty. You might think, well, they were deserving of some sort of punishment, and perhaps something odd happened. It's not the kind of situation, in that cultural context, maybe that you want to, take the landowner to court for murder. Maybe it's just too questionable of a situation. You might think about this, from a legal standpoint. You might think, well, perhaps the father is guilty, but are we really going to get a conviction? Is it going to be worth the time and effort to sort of go through the process, right, to secure the conviction? Whatever the case is, I think a lot of readers, a lot of people in the Athenian culture would think that Euthyphro's action here is surprising. And Euthyphro acts with so much conviction that Socrates is really surprised. And really, the surprise might be in a little bit of device, right, to elicit a certain kind of reaction from the reader or from Euthyphro. But Socrates really, I think, genuinely wants to know what kind of knowledge is guiding Euthyphro's conviction. Right? The idea here is that when you're engaging in an act that is questionable, if you're convinced, right, that this is the right thing to do, then you must have some sort of knowledge, right, that gives you that conviction. Right? So we might think, knowledge in some way or another is the right to be sure. So in a questionable matter, right, if you're acting with conviction, the thought is like, you really must know this. And so what Socrates wants to do is to engage Euthyphro in dialectic. He wants to find out what this knowledge is that Euthyphro has. So Socrates begins the inquiry by asking Euthyphro, well, look, can you tell me what piety is? I mean, you're very concerned to do the right act, the pious act. So I really want to know what is the nature of piety. Now, for a lot of people who are familiar with Socrates, this is the sort of paradigm Socratic question. So you take a concept, right, or a word, right, that is in a way a general term, right, and it's something that in some sense or another is difficult to find, and Socrates wants to know what is that thing, right? So a typical Socratic question is, what is knowledge? What is goodness? What is justice? What is the nature of the state? What is the human person? And so on. So Euthyphro, right, plays right along with Socrates, and he begins in 5e by listing a series of pious and impious acts. So Socrates asks, what is piety? And Euthyphro says, well, I'll tell you what piety is. Piety is, sacrificing to the gods. It's, convicting, indicting your father if he's guilty of murder, right? It's doing the kinds of things that I do. And impiety, right, that's, not common to the gods, and so on and so forth. Right? So he lists a series of acts. So Socrates says, okay, well, are there other pious acts? Are there other impious acts? And Euthyphro, realizing, yes, of course, right? I didn't give you a complete list, right, of pious and impious acts. So the list is incomplete. So what does that tell us about Euthyphro's first response? Well, it tells us that it's not adequate. It doesn't get at, right, the general nature of piety. We want an account of piety that somehow or other, right, is going to cover, right, all the pious acts, so that given that account, we can then say, sort of use it as a measuring stick. Say, well, is this pious? Is that pious? Is this impious? Is that impious? Right? So note what Socrates says here. So Socrates says, I didn't bid you tell me one or two of many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. Now the word there, form, is going to be very special as we come to some of the later Platonic dialogues that we'll talk about in a couple weeks. So we want to remember this, that Socrates is after, right, a general account of. Okay, so Euthyphro realizes that his answer is inadequate, that he didn't give him what Socrates wanted, and so now he's going to take a second try. It's always good to have a second chance, and Euthyphro actually does a lot better, right? So he learned that I can't give Socrates just a list. I got to give him some sort of general property that's going to cover, right, all the pious acts. So Euthyphro's second response is, well, what is dear to the gods is pious. Now, notice that what he did was he took a general property, and he's saying, like, well, what the nature of piety is it's whatever is dear to the gods, right? So you could kind of use this as a measuring stick if you're thinking, you just think, okay, well, if we can figure out what's dear to the gods, right, then we can figure out what's pious. If we can figure out what isn't dear to the gods, then we can figure out what is not pious, and so on. So the way to capture this, like as a general account, to be specific, is to use what's known as a necessary and sufficient condition account. Necessary and sufficient conditions to analyze a concept. So we have there the general account. So this general account, I'm going to minimize the screen just a little bit. So the general account says that an act is pious if and only if it is dear to the gods. So we have the first part, right? If an act is pious, then it's due to the gods. And the second part, right, that an act is pious only if it's due to the gods. So what we want to do is take some time to try to unpack this, to sort of understand how we should understand the general account. So we want to introduce some terminology, necessary and sufficient conditions. So some of you guys might be familiar with this from other philosophy classes, and some of you, this might be new terminology. So necessary and sufficient conditions are sort of standard philosophical terminology. It's professionally forbidden for you to get through an undergraduate philosophy degree without ever, right, coming across necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So, you want to take notes on this one, right? So in general, what a sufficient condition is so suppose you have a general condition A and you have another condition B. We say that A is sufficient for B, and here we say equal DF. This is the definition. So A is sufficient for B. By definition, what this means is that A alone guarantees, right, that B is true. Right? So if Euthyphro's general account were right, then being dear to the gods, right, is a sufficient condition, right, for being pious. If something is dear to the gods, right, then it's pious. Now, a necessary condition, right? A necessary condition, we say C is necessary for D. By definition, what this means is that D requires C to occur, right? So you can't have D without C. So here we think, what's a necessary condition for being pious? Well, if Euthyphro is right, a necessary condition for being pious is that it's dear to the gods, right? That this action is dear to the gods. So let's get some practice for this with some other examples. Okay, so roll tide. So we have here this image, which I've been told this is common property, so we can use it. So thank you, Nick, and thank you, the photographer and the football team. Right. So we want to get some practice with necessary and sufficient conditions. Right. So remember, right, the goal that we're after, right, is something along the lines of an analysis that says an act is good. Right. In Euthyphro's case, in this particular case, with the discussion that Euthyphro and Socrates are having, right, it's act pious, but we'll just focus on good. Right, an act is good if it only is blank. And what we're supposed to have in the blank is a set of conditions that are jointly, right, sufficient, necessary. Right, a set of conditions such that, in some sense or another, they explain what goodness is, and taken together, right, they're necessary and sufficient conditions for goodness. So that whenever, right, you have an act that's good, then, right, these conditions are going to obtain, and whenever those conditions obtain, right, then, right, the act is going to occur. Right. So let's just think this through with a toy example. So let's think, what are the necessary conditions for Alabama to win another championship? So football team here, we're thinking about what's going to be required in order for them to win a championship. And you think, well, a necessary condition is you got to play football games, right? You can't win a championship if you're not playing football games, all right? So, playing football games is a necessary condition. Well, if you're going to win a championship, you actually got to win some games. Right? If you lose all your games, you ain't going to make the playoffs. You ain't going to make, right? You're not going to make the championship. All right? And, you got to make the college playoffs, right? Can't win the championship without making the playoffs, right? Now you might think, well, what about having, right, a Heisman, right, quarterback? Is that a necessary condition for winning another championship? No, right? You can win without a Heisman quarterback. It certainly helps, right, to have, the best quarterback in college football, but it's not required. It's not a necessary condition. Well, could Alabama win another championship without Nick Saban? You might think, we don't want to consider that possibility because we really like Nick and we want him to stay around and we want him to help us out, right? But from a logical perspective, right, we could win without Nick Saban. I mean, perhaps, we hired that guy over in Clemson, or something like that, and maybe he worked out for us. So hopefully with this example, you can get the idea of, what necessary conditions are and what some necessary conditions are. So one of the things to note, right, about the necessary conditions that we listed is that, it's necessary that you play football games. But playing football games isn't a sufficient condition for the championship. You can play and not make it. In fact, lots of teams, right, have, right, that problem. Good old Vandy, right? Or Tennessee. So let's think about, what are some sufficient conditions? Is it sufficient to win football games? Right? Is winning football games a sufficient condition for making for winning another championship? No, right? You can win and not make the championship, right? You can win all your games, right, and not make the championship. I mean, this happened to Auburn. What was it, 1993? They were disqualified from postseason play. Is there sufficient condition having a Heisman quarterback? Well, no. We can think of lots of cases. Well, maybe not lots, but we can think of cases in which someone had a Heisman quarterback and they didn't win the championship. What about making the playoffs? Is that sufficient for winning the championship? We're like, no, of course not. So in this case, what is a sufficient condition for winning the national collegiate championship? And it can be kind of hard to describe. I mean, it's a condition that guarantees that you win, right? And so you might think, well, maybe it's just, right, having more points than the other team at the end of the final college football playoff game. All right, so I hope that that gives you a better grasp of what necessary and sufficient conditions are. We'll be using this throughout the course, so you'll have plenty of opportunities, right, to think about what's a necessary condition for something that we're investigating, what's a sufficient condition, and so on. So let's look more at the dilemma. So we get the statement of the dilemma on 10a. Now these little numbers and letters refer to, one of the authoritative, text of Plato's works. And we'll see this also with Aristotle. So these are not page numbers. You can see these on the left-hand and right-hand column, on the edges of the page as you're reading through. And it's a very easy way just to refer back to the text. Okay. So Socrates continues to investigate, this account that the second account that Euthyphro gave. Remember Euthyphro said that what's dear to the gods, that's the nature of piety. So Socrates asks, is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it's loved by the gods? So let's try that one more time. So Socrates asks, is the pious being loved by the gods because it's pious? Or is it pious because it's loved by the gods? Now the first time you come across this, you might be thinking, okay, hold on. What's going on here? This is sort of making, my head sort of spin around in circles. Right? So what Socrates is doing here is really clever. He's asking about what explains what. Right? So he wants to know, right, is it being loved by the gods, is that sort of what's explaining, right, an act being pious, or is it the other way around? Is it, that something's pious, right, that explains, like, why it's loved by the gods? So let's build up to this, right, by working through a few examples. So start with a really simple example. So I'm sure you guys, are all very familiar with the first two cases. So consider, right, a prime number, and we want to know what is a prime number. Right? So we might have this account of a prime number. N is a prime number if and only if n's a whole number and it's divisible only by itself in one. Right? So this is, an account of a prime number. Right? It tells you that if, right, you have a whole number and it's divisible only by itself in one, then it's a prime number. And, right, if something's prime number, then, right, it's got to be a whole number divisible only by one itself. Right? So here, it's really clear that what explains something being a prime number is the fact that it's a whole number and it's divisible by one itself. But this is sort of explanation by way of definition. This is just what it means, right, to be a prime number. So another example, right? S is a bachelor, if and only if S is an adult unmarried male. You might add of marriageable age, and not like a Catholic priest because they're unmarried, but definitions what we'll find, definitions we'll find really hard, right, to come about. So it's clear here in this case that the explanatorily primitive property is being an adult male that's unmarried. Right? That's what explains the fact that someone is bachelor. But again, it's very close to sort of definition. Right? So let's think about another example where the explanatory direction may be able to go in both ways. All right, so suppose, right, you're walking across campus and you see someone, you're like, I really like that person. Right? And you might think, well, why do you like that person? You don't even know that person. Right? You think, well, I like them because they're really attractive. All right? So you might try, well, your friends, after an ancient philosophy course, might try to figure out, all right, well, let's try to give an analysis of what it is to like another individual. Right? And you think, okay, well, here's an analysis. Right? S, this person S, likes R, this other person, if and only if R is attractive. So this is kind of like a conversation that you can have late at night, you know, in your dorm room or now over Zoom, right? So you're trying to give an analysis, right, of what it is, right, for one individual to like another. And your analysis is that it's explained by attraction, right, by being attractive, right? So this kind of makes sense, like liking might be explained by being attractive, right? Entirely makes sense. But what's interesting is that if you look at some results in cognitive psychology, it can also be reversed, right? It can be that you can find someone attractive because, right, you like them, right? So here the explanatory direction is reversed, right? It's not that liking is being explained by being attractive, right? It's that their being attractive is explained, right, by your liking them, right? So I hope this is the case that sort of makes a little more sense of like how questions of explanatory direction, right, can get gripped, right? Because it could still be the case, right, that the account's true, right? That S likes R if and only if R is attractive. But there's another question about what is explaining what, right? So the common sense way, or the common picture will say, with example 3, is that liking is being explained by being attractive. But then we point out that this isn't true in all cases. There are cases where being attractive is explained by liking. Okay, so let's continue our discussion of the dilemma. So hopefully you have a better grasp of the depth of Socrates' question, right, about explanatory direction. Okay, so here, right, we have a picture of a statue of Zeus with a thunderbolt in his hand. So here's the dilemma again. Do the gods love an act because it's pious? So here, right, piety would be explaining that the god's loving, or is an act pious because it's loved by the gods? And here it's being loved by the gods would be explaining why it's pious. Right? So we can put this in numbered claims that we could refer to and think about their implications. Right? So 1, if the gods love an act because it's pious, then being pious is explanatorily prior to being loved by the gods. So this is what Euthyphro would like. He would like to be able to give an account. No, take that back. Euthyphro doesn't like this because if he said one was true, then he would still like owe us an account of what piety is, right? Because now the thought is, if one's true, the thought is that what's going on with the gods liking certain acts is that they're tracking, right, whether or not those acts are pious, right? And so we want to know, well, what is piety in that case? So 2, right, is you know the other part of the dilemma, right? If an act is pious because it's loved by the gods, then being loved by the gods is explanatorily prior to being pious. And here, this is what Euthyphro, right, would like, because the prior property is being loved by the gods, and that in a way explains why an act is pious, right? So if one's true, then we don't have an account of piety, right? That in that case, Euthyphro's task would have failed. If 2 is true, right, then we have an account of piety that depends upon what the gods love. But Socrates has a trick up his sleeve, right? So let's see how that works out. So Euthyphro dispatched. Oops. So that is the goddess Athena over there, the goddess of wisdom. All right. So, as we said before, Euthyphro needs, right, this property of being loved by the gods to be explanatorily fundamental. And Socrates spends the last couple pages sort of getting at other aspects of this broad, like, normative domain. Right? So piety is one kind of normativity. More generally, we might ask, like, there's goodness and there's justice. Right? So if you look at 12a, Socrates asks, is there more to justice than piety? Now that's sort of my summary of what's going on there. He says it a little differently. So Socrates proposes that we need a more general account, right, of this normative, right, conception of, like, goodness and justice. Because piety, right, is just one kind of normativity, right? It might more generally, right, be concerned with what's just, right? And I think the reason that Socrates and Plato, of course, writing using Socrates as sort of his mouthpiece, right, uses this example is because it should seem clear that there's more, right, to justice than what the gods would like or not like. There's also a problem here that continues to inspire a lot of contemporary reflection. So if you're a monotheist, right, you might want to hold that in some sense or another, right, God is fundamental. And you don't want there to be, like, right or wrong in some sense or another, be independent of God. And so you might think something like, what goodness is, right, is a sort of reflection of the nature of God's character. Now, there's a lot to say here. We don't have time to go into this, but the Euthyphro problem is relevant to this, right? So let's just put it back in the polytheistic context of the Athenian pantheon, right? So the gods are just, right? You might think. But then, if we take Euthyphro's inspired account that justice is what's loved by the gods, right, and we replace it, right, then this amounts to saying that the gods are the kinds of beings that do what they love to do. And that's trivial, right? And so you might wonder, more generally, like if you're a monotheist and you think that something, right, about goodness is reflective of the nature of God, you might begin to wonder, well, when we say that God's good, we seem to be saying something more than just saying, well, God's nature is the way God's nature is. Right? And so the Euthyphro dilemma, right, takes on this new life in this monotheistic context, right, where it could force one into thinking that in order to make sense of informative ascriptions of goodness to God, one has to have a standard of goodness outside of God's nature. So we can talk more about that perhaps in the Zoom meeting. If I have time later in the week, I might post a little more video about that. So I hope you guys have a good weekend. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. Looking forward to meeting you on Zoom and talking to you. So y'all take care and talk to you soon. Well done.